terrifying road. The wind whispered through the trees as I embarked on a fateful night drive through the desolate countryside. The clock had just struck midnight, and the darkness had settled in like a heavy shroud. I was alone, save for the eerie glow of my dashboard lights, and the only sound was the rhythmic hum of the engine. I had always been drawn to the thrill of the unknown, and that night was no different. I decided to take a detour from my usual route and explore the winding back roads that led deeper into the wilderness. Little did I know that this decision would lead me into a nightmare I would never forget. The road ahead was narrow and poorly maintained, with patches of cracked asphalt and overgrown vegetation encroaching from both sides. The air grew colder, and a sense of unease settled in the pit of my stomach. The solitude was oppressive, and my only source of comfort was the soft glow of the radio. As I continued to navigate the winding road, a dense fog began to roll in, reducing visibility to almost nothing. I slowed down, gripping the steering wheel tightly. The only sound now was the deafening silence of the fog, broken only by the occasional hoot of an owl or the rustling of unseen creatures in the underbrush. Suddenly, the headlights illuminated a figure standing in the middle of the road. I slammed on the brakes, my heart pounding in my chest. It was a man, disheveled and drenched in rain. He held out his hand in a desperate plea for help. My initial instinct was to drive past, fearing the worst, but something about his forlorn expression compelled me to stop. I cautiously rolled down my window and asked if he needed assistance. His voice trembled as he explained that his car had broken down a few miles back, and he had been walking in the rain for hours. He looked vulnerable and lost, so against my better judgment, I offered him a ride. As he settled into the passenger seat, he introduced himself as Daniel. He appeared to be in his late 30s, with haunted eyes that told a story of hardship. He was soaked to the bone, and his teeth chattered as he tried to express his gratitude. I couldn't help but feel a mixture of sympathy and unease. We continued down the dark, fog-shrouded road, with Daniel providing directions to where he claimed to have left his car. The fog seemed to grow thicker, making it nearly impossible to see more than a few feet ahead. My headlights cast eerie shadows that danced along the tree line, creating a surreal and unsettling atmosphere. As we drove deeper into the heart of the wilderness, my unease intensified. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off about Daniel. His story seemed too perfect, his timing too coincidental. Paranoia gnawed at me as I stole glances at him from the corner of my eye. Finally, Daniel directed me to a narrow dirt road that led even further into the woods. I hesitated, my instinct screaming at me to turn around and leave him there. But he insisted that his car was just up ahead, and he promised to repay my kindness. Reluctantly, I turned onto the dirt road, feeling like I was entering the heart of darkness itself. The road was rough, and the car's suspension protested with each bump and jolt. My heart raced as my anxiety grew, and I realized we were completely isolated, far from any sign of civilization. Suddenly, the headlights illuminated a dilapidated cabin at the end of the road. It was nestled deep in the woods, its windows shattered, and its roof sagging. Daniel's demeanor changed abruptly, and he urged me to stop. "Here it is," he said, his voice low and sinister. "You can drop me off here." I stared at the cabin in horror, realizing that I had been lured into a trap. Panic surged through me as I slammed on the gas pedal, desperately trying to turn the car around. But before I could react, Daniel pulled out a knife, its blade glinting in the dim light. He lunged at me, and a frantic struggle ensued. I fought with all my strength, my fear giving me an adrenaline-fueled surge of power. The car swerved wildly as we grappled, and I managed to break free and push him out the door. I sped away from that accursed cabin, leaving Daniel behind in the darkness. The fog seemed to lift as I returned to the main road, and the world slowly returned to normal. I never looked back, too terrified to see if he was chasing after me. I never reported the incident to the police, fearing what might happen if I did. To this day, I can't shake the feeling that I narrowly escaped a nightmarish fate on that terrifying night drive. The memory haunts my dreams, a constant reminder of the darkness that can lurk in the most remote corners of the world. 2 a.m. I had always been an insomniac, often finding myself awake long after the world had gone to sleep. It was on one of those sleepless nights that I made a decision that would haunt me forever, a decision to embark on a late-night drive through the desolate countryside. The clock on my bedside table blinked 2 a.m. when I finally threw on a jacket and grabbed the keys to my old sedan. Moonlight cast eerie shadows as I stepped out into the crisp night air. The idea of driving alone on empty country roads had always held a strange allure for me, but this night, it was different. A sense of foreboding hung in the air. I pulled out of my driveway and onto the narrow, winding road that led into the heart of the countryside. The road was flanked by dense woods on either side, their looming trees casting long, ominous silhouettes in the moonlight. The only sounds were the gentle hum of the engine and the occasional rustling of leaves in the wind. As I continued down the road, a thick fog began to roll in, reducing visibility to nearly nothing. Panic set in briefly as I realized that I could barely see a few feet in front of me. I debated turning back, but something compelled me to keep going. Perhaps it was the thrill of the unknown or the desire to conquer my fear. Minutes stretched into hours as I navigated the treacherous fog. It felt like an eternity, and I was disoriented, unable to tell if I was still on the road or had veered off into the woods. My heart raced, and beads of sweat formed on my brow as anxiety gnawed at me. Suddenly, the car's headlights illuminated a figure standing in the middle of the road. I slammed on the brakes, my heart leaping into my throat. A woman, disheveled and drenched in rain, stared at me with hollow, lifeless eyes. She wore a tattered white gown that clung to her frail frame. My initial instinct was to drive away, to flee from this eerie encounter, but something about her desperate expression tugged at my conscience. I couldn't just leave her there in the middle of nowhere. I cautiously rolled down my window and asked if she needed help. Her voice trembled as she explained that her car had broken down a few miles back, and she had been walking in the rain for hours, searching for help. She looked fragile and lost, her skin pale and her lips blue from the cold. Despite my apprehension, I unlocked the car doors and invited her inside. She introduced herself as Sarah, her voice barely more than a whisper. She had a haunting aura about her, like a ghostly presence that had materialized out of the fog. We continued down the eerie, fog-shrouded road, with Sarah providing directions to where she had left her car. The fog seemed to grow denser, creating an almost otherworldly atmosphere. My unease intensified, but I couldn't abandon her in this desolation. As we drove deeper into the wilderness, Sarah's demeanor changed. She grew increasingly agitated, her fingers tapping nervously on her lap. She kept glancing out of the window as if expecting something to emerge from the woods. "Are you okay?" I asked, my voice quivering. She didn't respond, but instead, she leaned forward, her eyes wide with terror, and pointed ahead. My heart raced as I saw it, a twisted, gnarled tree that seemed to stretch across the road like a malevolent beast. It had not been there before, and its sudden appearance was jarring. I slammed on the brakes, but it was too late. The car collided with the tree with a deafening crash. My head slammed against the steering wheel, and the world spun around me. For a moment, everything went dark. When I came to, the fog had lifted, and the moon hung high in the sky. The car was a wreck, its front end crumpled against the twisted tree. I groaned in pain as I tried to move. That's when I realized that Sarah was gone. Panic surged through me as I stumbled out of the car and called out her name. There was no response, just the eerie silence of the night. I searched the surrounding area, my heart pounding, but she had vanished without a trace. In the distance, I heard the faint sound of sirens approaching. It was a police car, and soon, they arrived at the scene, finding me alone, bewildered, and injured. I tried to explain what had happened, about the mysterious woman named Sarah, but they found no evidence of her existence. No footprints, no sign of a struggle, nothing. They assumed I had suffered a concussion and was hallucinating. They never found any record of an accident involving a tree on that road, and to this day, the memory of that terrifying night drive haunts me. I can't help but wonder if Sarah was a ghost, a figment of my sleep-deprived imagination, or something far more sinister lurking in the fog. Haunting Highway. It was a moonless night when my friend Jake and I decided to take a late-night drive along a desolate stretch of highway that was notorious for its eerie reputation. This was no ordinary road, it was whispered about in hushed tones, with tales of ghostly apparitions, vanishing cars, and unexplained accidents. Naturally, we were both skeptics, but curiosity got the better of us, and we set out for a night neither of us would ever forget. The highway stretched endlessly before us, flanked by dense forests on either side. The darkness was oppressive, broken only by the faint glow of our headlights. It was well past midnight, and there was no other traffic in sight. The only sound was the hum of the engine and the soft murmur of Jake's nervous laughter. As we drove deeper into the night, a thick fog began to roll in, obscuring our vision and heightening our unease. We rolled down the windows, allowing the cool breeze to cut through the tension in the car. We scoffed at the superstitions, mocking the stories of phantom hitchhikers and spectral truckers. However, our bravado began to wane as the highway seemed to stretch on endlessly, with no signs of civilization in sight. It was as though we had entered another dimension, isolated from the world we knew. The fog grew denser, reducing visibility to mere feet ahead. That's when we saw it, a pair of headlights in the distance. A feeling of relief washed over us as we realized we weren't alone on this desolate road. We slowed down, and as the approaching vehicle drew nearer, we realized it was a sleek, black sedan. The sedan pulled up alongside us, and we could see the driver through the tinted windows. He was an elderly man with thinning white hair and a sharp, angular face. He wore a suit that seemed strangely out of place on this isolated highway. He motioned for us to roll down our window. "Are you boys lost?" he asked in a gravelly voice that sent shivers down our spines. We explained that we were just taking a late-night drive, and he smiled, revealing a row of yellowed teeth. His eyes, however, were cold and calculating. "You shouldn't be out here at this hour," he warned, his voice dripping with an ominous tone. "This highway is not what it seems." We exchanged nervous glances, unsure of how to respond. Before we could react, the old man's sedan pulled away and disappeared into the fog, leaving us with a feeling of dread that settled in the pit of our stomachs. As we continued down the highway, the fog seemed to close in around us, suffocating and disorienting. The world outside our car became a murky abyss, and it felt like we were driving through a nightmare. Our skepticism had evaporated, replaced by a growing sense of unease. Minutes turned into hours as we drove deeper into the fog, our surroundings becoming increasingly surreal. The highway seemed to stretch on endlessly, with no exits or signs of civilization. Panic began to take hold, and I could see the fear in Jake's eyes. Suddenly, we saw it again, the same black sedan from before, parked on the shoulder of the road. It seemed to appear out of nowhere, its headlights piercing through the thick fog. Jake slammed on the brakes, and we came to a stop a few feet behind the mysterious car. A sense of dread washed over us as we realized that there was no one inside the sedan. The driver's seat was empty, and the car idled ominously in the middle of the highway. We exchanged frantic whispers, debating whether to turn back or continue forward. Before we could make a decision, the sedan's headlights turned off, plunging us into complete darkness. Panic surged through us as we fumbled for our flashlights and tried to restart our own car. The eerie silence was shattered by the sound of footsteps approaching from behind. We turned to see a figure emerging from the fog, a tall, shadowy figure wearing a tattered trench coat. He moved slowly, his footsteps echoing in the silence. My heart pounded as I realized that there was something deeply wrong about this situation. With trembling hands, Jake managed to start our car, and we peeled away from the scene, leaving the mysterious sedan and its ghostly driver behind. As we drove, we couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, as though unseen eyes followed our every move. Eventually, the fog began to lift, and the first rays of dawn broke through the horizon. We found ourselves on a deserted stretch of highway, far from the strange encounter we had just fled. The terror of that night drive still hung over us, and we vowed never to return to that desolate road. To this day, Jake and I can't explain what happened on that highway. Was it a shared hallucination brought on by exhaustion and fear, or did we truly encounter something supernatural? We may never know, but one thing is certain: the memory of that night will haunt us for the rest of our lives.